They said the river never gave anything back, that if it took you, it was done with you. But that morning the river was wrong. Before we go any further, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The land lay still at dawn, not calm, just quiet in the way places get when they're holding their breath. Dry winds slid through tall grass along the canyon rim, whispering through brittle brush and bending it low. A jackrabbit burst from cover as hooves approached, vanishing into the rocks, and then there was nothing else moving at all. The sky stretched wide and pale overhead, holding on to the last chill of night like it wasn't ready to let go. Thorn Maddox rode the narrow ridge trail above the river, one hand loose on the reins, the other hanging at his side. His coat was worn thin at the cuffs, the collar stiff and sun-faded, shaped by years of weather and use. He hadn't shaved in days. The mule-colored horse beneath him moved steady and sure, accustomed to the silence they shared. Thorn didn't talk unless he had reason to. At 43, he'd lived more life than he'd ever wanted. Once he'd worn Union blue. Once he'd ridden with cavalry columns and come home with a shattered knee and a folded burial flag stuffed deep in a satchel. His wife and young daughter died of fever the winter after he returned. Since then he kept to himself, running cattle on a spread wedged between canyon edge and timberline. Folks learned to leave him alone. He preferred it that way. That morning, he was checking the south fence after a storm tore through 2 nights before. He hadn't slept much. Cold always stirred the old injury, and the river had a habit of shifting ground where it shouldn't. He dismounted near a bend where the fence dipped, close to the water, and saw right away something wasn't right. The post he'd reset last fall leaned again, soil eaten away beneath it. He crouched, bracing on his good leg, fingers digging into damp earth. Worse than he thought. The river had run higher than it should have. Another season like this, and the land would start slipping away entirely. He straightened slowly, hand pressed to his lower back, and that's when he heard it. A splash, not a fish, not debris, heavy, human. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the glare-cut water. At first, there was only current and foam. Then movement. A body half under, twisting weakly. An arm broke the surface, vanished again. Panic hit him fast and hard. No time for thought. He dropped his tools, shrugged off his coat, and moved. Limping, cursing, he slid down the embankment. Boots punching through. Soft ground until he hit the river's edge and dove without hesitation. The water was colder than he expected, knocking the breath clean from his lungs. The current dragged at his legs. His knees screamed, but he drove forward anyway, arms cutting, hard through the water. She surfaced once just ahead of him, young face framed by black hair, mouth open like she was trying to cry out. 3 more strokes and he reached her, hooked an arm around her waist, and kicked with everything he had to get them back to shore. She was barely conscious. Her skin was icy, lips pale, breath shallow. A soaked deerskin dress clung to her, torn at the neckline, exposing the soft rise of her chest as she gasped. Her feet were bare. Scratches lined her arms, and a bruise darkened near her temple. Thorn hauled them onto the bank and dropped to his knees, propping her upright. She coughed, retched up river water, then sagged. Her eyes opened just enough to meet his, dark, frightened, but aware. Apache, he realized, heart still hammering. He looked downriver, half expecting shouts or riders. Nothing but wind and water. "Where'd you come from?" he muttered. She couldn't answer. He scanned the bank, mind already turning. He couldn't leave her. She was freezing, barely breathing. His cabin sat half a mile uphill. Firewood, blankets, a bed. He didn't hesitate. He lifted her, one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees. She was heavier than she looked, soaked and limp, her head resting against his chest, breath faint against his collar. He gritted his teeth and started uphill. Each step sent fire through his knee, but he didn't stop. He passed his horse, which pawed nervously, and carried her through the trees to the small cabin tucked between 2 pines. Inside, he laid her gently on the bed and covered her with every blanket he owned. He pulled off her moccasins, checked her ankle, twisted, not broken. He hesitated when he reached for the blanket again. The torn dress left little hidden. He draped his old wool coat over her shoulders, turned away, and went to build a fire. Kneeling at the hearth, hands still shaking, he struck a match. The flame caught slow. When it did, he stood and looked back. She was watching him through heavy lids. Her lips moved, no sound. He stepped closer. "You're safe," he said quietly. "You're all right." She blinked once. He didn't ask who she was. Not yet, maybe it didn't matter. He pulled a chair to the far corner and sat, staring into the fire, jaw tight. He didn't know what he'd invited into his home, only that he couldn't have left her there. Dawn crept into full morning. Firelight stretched across the floor. Her breathing steadied, color slowly returning to her face. Thorne hadn't slept. He stayed in the chair, damp clothes clinging, knee aching, thoughts circling. She stirred, fingers tightening around the edge of his coat. When her eyes opened, they landed on him, watchful, cautious, not afraid. "You understand me?" he asked. A pause, a small nod. "You hurt?" She winced and touched her ankle. He crossed the room, knelt, and wrapped it carefully with clean cloth. Her eyes never left him. Her dress still hung torn and damp beneath the coat. He noticed, but didn't linger. He stepped back. "Name?" he asked after a while. "Sana," she said softly. "Thorne." He tapped his chest. Her gaze moved around the cabin, stopping on the rifle by the door. "Safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure. He went outside to tend the horse, needing space. Inside, Sana eased upright, clutching his coat. The silence wasn't threatening. When he returned with water and jerky, she tried to smooth the torn dress. She drank slowly, watching him. "Family?" he asked gently. She looked away, jaw tight. "All right," he said. They spoke little that day. Words weren't needed. He fixed the fence post with his thoughts stuck on the cabin. That night, she slept curled beneath blankets, his coat still around her. He stood in the doorway a long time, unsure what came next. Only that she wasn't going anywhere. Morning came grey and fog-laden. He stirred the fire. She woke quietly. They shared water and beans, cornbread hard but filling. When she tried to stand, he stopped her. "Not yet." He rewrapped her ankle. Bruises told him enough. "Anyone coming after you?" She shook her head. "Family?" "No." He handed her one of his flannel shirts. She changed behind a quilt. When she stepped out, hair braided loose, the shirt swallowing her frame, legs bare, he looked away. She began sweeping, folding, tending the fire. She wasn't being polite. She was taking space. He rode out to check cattle, left her with fire and rifle. The river story didn't add up. He returned at dusk to find her mending her dress on the porch, one leg propped, hands steady. He sat beside her in silence. "You're staying until you heal," he said. She nodded. That night, she sat in his chair by the fire while he cleaned a rifle. When she finally lay down behind him, close but not touching, neither spoke. The fire burned low. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The fourth morning broke colder than the others. Frost clung to the porch rail, thin and white, and the chimney sent up a straight line of smoke into a pale sky. Thorne stood at the woodpile behind the cabin, splitting logs in a steady rhythm, careful with his footing. They slicked the ground, and his bad knee didn't allow for mistakes. He didn't look back toward the cabin, but his thoughts stayed there all the same. Sana hadn't said much since arriving, but she watched everything. The way he shifted his weight when the cold set in, the way his eyes slid away when her dress slipped loose at the shoulder, the way he never pressed her for answers. He carried the wood inside just after sunup. She was already awake, kneeling at the hearth, coaxing the fire with practiced movements. Her mended dress lay folded on the table. She wore his shirt again, sleeves rolled, collar loose, hem brushing her thighs. Her bare legs eyes never left him. Her dress still hung torn and damp beneath the coat. He noticed, but didn't linger. He stepped back. "Name?" he asked after a while. "Sana," she said softly. "Thorne." He tapped his chest. Her gaze moved around the cabin, stopping on the rifle by the door. "Safe here," he said, though he wasn't sure. He went outside to tend the horse, needing space. Inside, Sana eased upright, clutching his coat. The silence wasn't threatening. When he returned with water and jerky, she tried to smooth the torn dress. She drank slowly, watching him. "Family?" he asked gently. She looked away, jaw tight. "All right," he said. They spoke little that day. Words weren't needed. He fixed the fence post with his thoughts stuck on the cabin. That night she slept curled beneath blankets, his coat still around her. He stood in the doorway a long time, unsure what came next. Only that she wasn't going anywhere. Morning came grey and fog-laden. He stirred the fire. She woke quietly. They shared water and beans, cornbread hard but filling. When she tried to stand, he stopped her. Not yet. He rewrapped her ankle. Bruises told him enough. Anyone coming after you? She shook her head. Family? No. He handed her one of his flannel shirts. She changed behind a quilt. When she stepped out, hair braided loose, the shirt swallowing her frame, legs bare, he looked away. She began sweeping, folding, tending the fire. She wasn't being polite. She was taking space. He rode out to check cattle, left her with fire and rifle. The river story didn't add up. He returned at dusk to find her mending her dress on the porch, one leg propped, hand steady. He sat beside her in silence. "You're staying until you heal," he said. She nodded. That night, she sat in his chair by the fire while he cleaned a rifle. When she finally lay down behind him, close but not touching, neither spoke. The fire burned low. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The fourth morning broke colder than the others. Frost clung to the porch rail, thin and white, and the chimney sent up a straight line of smoke into a pale sky. Thorn stood at the woodpile behind the cabin, splitting logs in a steady rhythm, careful with his footing. They slicked the ground, and his bad knee didn't allow for mistakes. He didn't look back toward the cabin, but his thoughts stayed there all the same. Sana hadn't said much since arriving, but she watched everything. The way he shifted his weight when the cold set in. The way his eyes slid away when her dress slipped loose at the shoulder. The way he never pressed her for answers. He carried the wood inside just after sunup. She was already awake, kneeling at the hearth, coaxing the fire with practiced movements. Her mended dress lay folded on the table. She wore his shirt again, sleeves rolled, collar loose, hem brushing her thighs. Her bare legs were silent, the nights beside her. He nodded once. The riders left. Sana stayed. Winter deepened, but the cabin grew warmer. She moved through it like she belonged. One morning he found her barefoot in the snow, breathing the cold. He wrapped a blanket around her. "Not cold," she said. "Here feels warm." They spoke of the past only when needed. She asked about his wife, his daughter. He answered. She said, "I don't replace. I stay." That was enough. By spring the snow retreated. The river calmed. Sana knelt in the garden, hand resting low on her belly. "You know," he said. "I know," she replied. They stood together in the evening light, arms linked. She chose this place. He chose her. There was no law stronger than that. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slow, testing the land, sending pale shoots through, thawing soil and softening the river's edges day by day. Snow lingered in the shadows, tucked beneath trees and along the north face of the canyon. But the sun climbed higher now, warming the cabin roof and loosening the grip winter had held for months. Thorn felt it in his knee first, the ache easing just a little each morning. He didn't say anything about it. He rarely did. Sana noticed anyway. She always did. She moved beside him as he worked the land. Barefoot when the ground allowed, careful when it didn't, she carried water from the creek, mended harness straps, patched a tear in his coat he'd ignored for years. She never asked if she should. She simply did. That was how she stayed. Not by words, but by presence. The cabin changed, without either of them calling it change. Her shawl hung beside his coat. Her moccasins sat next to his boots. A second cup rested on the table. A second pillow lay on the bed. She planted herbs near the porch, ones he didn't recognize, and told him their names slowly, letting him repeat them until he got them close enough. At night, they sat by the fire. Sometimes she braided her hair while he read from an old book. Sometimes she rested against his shoulder in silence, listening to the wind. They spoke when there was something worth saying. When there wasn't, they let the quiet do the work. He didn't ask her to stay. She didn't ask for permission. It settled between them like it had always belonged there. One afternoon, while they repaired the east fence, he stumbled, knee buckling under strain. He caught himself before he fell, but she was already there, hand firm on his arm. "Sit," she said. "I'm fine," he replied. She studied him, then nodded once, letting it go. She learned quickly when to push and when to let him be. As they rested beneath a cottonwood, sharing dried meat and bread, she watched a hawk circle overhead. "Why you live alone?" she asked. He thought for a while. "I was afraid to care again." She turned toward him, eyes steady. "Still afraid?" He met her gaze. Less, she reached for his hand and held it without comment. That was her way. When the riders didn't return, and no one else came looking, something in Sana eased. She laughed once while they worked in the garden, a quiet sound that surprised him. It stayed with him all day. That night she undressed slowly in the firelight, not shy, not hurried. He didn't look away this time. He crossed the room and pulled her close, hands familiar now, sure. They moved together with the kind of ease that comes from trust, not urgency. After she lay against him, tracing the scar along his knee with gentle fingers. "It hurt," she said. "Still does," he replied. She nodded, understanding more than the words. Snow returned once more before winter finally broke, heavy and quiet. He woke early that morning to the sound of hooves again, distant but real. Sana was awake before he reached for the rifle. She handed it to him without fear. 6 riders emerged from the trees, calm, unarmed. The elder dismounted, spoke in their tongue. Sana answered. Thorn watched her face, reading the steadiness there. When the elder turned to him, his voice was measured. "She's safe," he said. Thorn nodded. "She is. Then our concern is finished." They left without ceremony. Sana exhaled only after they were gone. Inside, she removed his coat and hung it by the door. She stirred the fire, dress shifting at the neckline. He watched her, then knelt beside her. "They say you belong to me," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "Do you believe that?" He shook his head. "I think we chose each other." She smiled, small and real. That night they didn't rush. They moved together with certainty, with weight. It felt different now, settled, like something had been named without words. Days passed in steady rhythm. Sana no longer asked if she could help. She organized the shelves, stitched his shirts, cleaned tools, learned the cattle paths. One morning, he found her standing barefoot in the snow, eyes closed, breathing slow. He wrapped a blanket around her. "You'll freeze," he said. She leaned into him. "It doesn't feel cold." He didn't argue. She asked about his wife one evening. "Claire," he said. She was kind. About his daughter. Ruth, she liked horses. Sana listened, then said softly, "I don't replace them." "I know," he replied. "I stay," she added. "That's enough." Spring came fully then. The river calmed, running clear. Sana knelt in the garden one morning, hand resting low across her belly. He noticed the way she moved, careful, protective. "You know," he said. She nodded. "I know." He didn't smile. He didn't panic. He simply knelt beside her and placed his hand where hers rested. They stayed like that a long while. That evening, they sat on the porch, sky burning orange over the ridge. "You think about leaving?" he asked. "No," she said. "I choose this," he nodded. Later, under moonlight, she placed his hand back on her belly. "You teach him cattle?" she asked. "If he wants," he said. "If she corrected gently. He smiled then, quiet and full. Inside, the bed waited. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like arrival. Spring settled fully over the canyon. Not all at once, but with a patience that felt earned. The mornings grew softer, the cold loosening its grip, the light stretching longer across the land. Thorn woke each day to the sound of birds, where once there had only been wind, and to the steady warmth of Sana beside him, her breathing even, her body curved into his, as if the space had always been shaped for her. He no longer startled awake expecting silence. The cabin held them now. It knew their weight, their footsteps, the way Sana hummed quietly while stirring a pot, the way Thorn paused at the doorway each evening to take in the sight of her there before stepping inside. The land changed too. The garden pushed up green shoots where only frost had been. The fence lines held. The river ran clear, no longer swollen with violence, its voice calmer, almost companionable. Thorn worked the fields with his sleeves rolled and sweat on his brow, his knee still stiff some mornings, but no longer ruling him. Sana moved nearby, barefoot in the dirt, dress hitched to her knees, braids swinging down her back. She planted seeds with care, pressing the earth gently, her palm often resting low. against her belly, as if in quiet conversation with the life growing there. Thorn noticed always. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. Some things were understood now without being named. They moved together through their days, not bound by routine but by rhythm. She learned the cattle paths and he learned the names of her herbs. She teased him once for his careful way of stepping over roots, and he raised an eyebrow at her bare feet in cold soil. The laughter that followed surprised them both, brief but real, leaving warmth behind long after it faded. Evenings found them on the porch, watching the sun slide behind the ridge, the sky bleeding orange and purple. Sometimes they spoke of nothing. Sometimes Sana told small pieces of her past, not the cruel parts she'd already shared, but the good ones, a river where she'd swum as a child, the smell of smoke at dawn in her mother's camp, the sound of drums carried over distance. Thorn listened, storing the sound of her voice like something precious. In return he spoke of cattle drives, of his father teaching him to ride, of Claire's laugh when he tracked mud into the house, of Ruth's small hand curled around his finger. The memories hurt less now. They didn't fade, but they softened, fitting into a life that had room for them again. One afternoon, as clouds gathered thick and low, Sana stood in the doorway watching him mend a gate. "Storm coming?" she said. Thorn glanced at the sky. "Yeah," he replied. They worked faster, side by side, finishing just as rain began to fall. They ran for the cabin, laughing as the first drops soaked through their clothes. Inside, rain drummed against the roof, steady and loud, and they stood dripping on the wooden floor, looking at each other. Sana reached for him first, fingers curling into his shirt, her mouth lifting toward his. They kissed without urgency, without doubt, water slick on their skin. The world narrowed to warmth and closeness, and the sound of rain. Later, wrapped in blankets by the fire, Sana rested her head on his chest, listening to his heart. "You ever regret staying here?" she asked softly. Thorn thought for a moment. "I regretted leaving before," he said. "I don't regret this." She nodded, satisfied. The question didn't linger. Nothing between them needed to be tested anymore. When the riders did not return again, and no strangers crossed their land, the days took on a deeper quiet. Sana no longer scanned the tree line with the same alertness. She slept deeply now, sometimes dreaming, murmuring words in her language Thorn didn't understand but felt all the same. He held her through it, anchoring her without waking her, learning the shape of her fears by how she stilled against him afterward. One morning he found her standing at the edge of the river, watching the water. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. She turned when she sensed him, her face calm. "It doesn't scare me now," she said. He stood beside her. "Good," he replied. They watched the current a long time. Back at the cabin, Sana began preparing for the changes ahead without ceremony. She sewed small garments late at night by lamplight, her hands steady, her expression thoughtful. Thorn pretended not to notice at first, then finally asked, "You need anything?" She looked up at him, eyes warm. "Just you," she said. That answer settled something deep in him. When the first real heat of summer arrived, Sana moved slower, her belly rounding beneath her dress, her steps careful but sure. Thorn adjusted without being asked. He took on heavier tasks, insisted she rest when the sun climbed too high. She didn't argue much, but when she did, it was quiet and firm. "I'm not broken," she reminded him once. He smiled then, conceding. "I know," he said. One evening, as cicadas hummed and the sky darkened, Sana sat on the bed braiding her hair. She looked up suddenly. "They will ask someday," she said, "who the child belongs to." Thorn stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "They can ask," he said. "I know the answer." She studied his face, then nodded. Good. They didn't speak of marriage again. They didn't need words for what already existed. The law that mattered lived in their daily choosing, in the way he reached for her each morning, in the way she waited for him at dusk. Late one night, with the windows open and stars spilling light across the floor, Sana woke him by placing his hand on her belly. "Feel," she whispered. He stilled, then felt it, a small, undeniable movement beneath his palm. His breath caught. He laughed quietly, a sound rough and disbelieving. Sana smiled in the dark, proud and calm. "Strong," she said. "Like you." He shook his head. "Like you," he corrected. She accepted that without argument. As the months passed, the land flourished. The garden thrived. The cattle grew sleek. And inside the cabin, life gathered, patient and sure. Thorn sometimes stood in the doorway watching Sana move through their space, marveling at how natural it felt now, how inevitable. The woman he'd pulled from the river, half dead now, carried their future with steady grace. He didn't believe much in fate, but he believed in moments, in choices made without fanfare that shaped everything afterward. The day Sana went into labor, it came quietly at first. She woke him before dawn, her hand on his arm. "It's time," she said simply. Fear flared in him, sharp and fast, but he kept his voice steady. "All right," he said. "I'm here." And he was. Through the long hours, through pain and strength, and the sound of rain returning softly to the roof, Thorn stayed with her, holding her, grounding her, learning a new kind of helplessness that wasn't weakness at all. When the child finally came, strong and loud, Sana cried out once, not in pain but release, and Thorn felt his chest crack open with something fierce and overwhelming. He held them both afterward, hands shaking, heart full to bursting. Sana rested against him, exhausted and radiant, the child warm and alive between them. She looked up at him, eyes shining. "Family," she said. Thorn nodded, unable to speak. Outside, the river flowed on, indifferent and eternal, but inside the cabin, something had been answered at last. In the days that followed, life rearranged itself again, this time gently. Thorn learned the weight of the child in his arms, learned the sound of Sana's laughter when he fumbled, learned the quiet pride of watching them sleep together by the fire. The silence that once haunted him was gone, replaced by small sounds, breath and movement and life. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the world glowed gold, Thorn stood on the porch with Sana beside him, the child cradled between them. He thought of the morning he'd heard a splash in the river, of how close everything had come to ending before it began. Sana leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. "You still think the river never gives anything back?" she asked softly. Thorn watched the water glint in the fading light and shook his head. "No," he said. "Sometimes it gives you everything." And that was the truth. Opening cinematic visual prompt for video generation. A wide, cinematic shot at dawn of a rugged canyon river under pale early morning light, mist rising from cold water. Tall, dry grass bending in the wind along the bank. A weathered middle-aged cowboy with a limp dives into the river, urgency frozen in motion, his face strained with determination, while a young indigenous woman with long dark hair struggles in the current, half submerged, reaching out. Dramatic lighting with cool blues and muted golds, high realism, shallow depth of field, water droplets suspended in the air. Raw emotion visible on both faces, epic Western atmosphere, cinematic framing, ultra-detailed textures, powerful, intense mood.